Has society become increasingly risky due to advancements in technology?
I think this is an interesting question, and my short answer to that would be no. Actually, quite the opposite. It has become less risky, and I think a good example of that would be automobiles. So, any good Canadian is going to know, for example, traction control is a fabulous thing. Airbags, safety belts in a variety of different ways. I think society has actually become safer. I think that's what's interesting about the context.
What problems might arise from living with technologies that make our lives better but also bring risks?
This is where I think the problem becomes interesting, because it's sort of the inverse of what I just talked about. And I think there are three things you want to pay attention to. One of them is we can't control the risks. So let me take you back to the image of automobiles. The Toyota recall was particularly interesting because it was either floor mats or a problem with the acceleration system. And the acceleration system is controlled by a computer, hence the technology. And that's what makes the traction control possible. But it's also what becomes a problem because we don't necessarily have direct control now over what goes on. And so the computer can react faster than we can in most situations, making it safer. But here's the interesting problem. Is that computer also what's causing the acceleration problems that led to the Toyota recall? And we just don't know the instance. So that's one instance of where it's a problem. Second is scale and complexity, and so the listeriosis is an interesting instance of that. If you think about what was going on there, the ability for Maple Leaf Foods to produce a food in a very reliable manner is a remarkable thing. But the scale at which they do that is also extraordinary. And so the consequence is there are a lot more people that are affected. So if you buy from your local butcher, it's only people locally that are affected, whereas Maple Leaf Foods distributes across the entire country. Huge problems that come with that. And you can think of other instances. What's fascinating, for example, in shipping, which is the context that we deal with, ships are becoming increasingly large. Best illustration would be oil tankers. The biggest oil tankers these days are a half-kilometer long. Extraordinary scale. And you just kind of imagine trying to steer something like that and the complexities that come with that. That's the kind of problem that emerges. Or the BP disaster and sort of the scale at which that happened is extraordinary. And this is, I think, where the interesting leadership questions come in, because it means the population that is affected is a lot broader. And so there are people who don't necessarily have control of the outcomes that are now affected. And so from a leadership standpoint, you need to take into account the impacts of what's going on. I think it's a huge problem with the technologies.
Why do many problems of risk management occur in low-risk settings?
So I think there are two reasons for that. One of them is psychology. So from the standpoint of psychology, because they're low-risk settings, we tend to think of them as safe. And so we don't worry. And especially if we're leaders in that context, we focus on the safety. And as a consequence, we get a distorted sense of what might actually happen. And the second explanation then comes from sociology, because you think about the attention structures that are constructed to make us pay attention to different things. You might not pay attention to the risks. So for the ferry settings that we're studying, what's interesting is there's this long record of millions of sailings that are completely successful. No accidents, practically no deaths. And then suddenly this one event where over 800 people die in one setting. And a lot of what's going on is the concentration was on the financial success. The organizations took their eyes off of safety issues, and some real significant problems obviously then occurred.
Why is it important for firms to learn from the rare failures and near failures of other organizations?
I think there's an interesting issue that comes out of this, and it's basically weak signals that you want to pay attention to. What we're dealing with when we talk about rare failures or even near failures is what you might think of as the tail of the distribution, and they're really weak signals that are going on. And so, contrast the financial success of the ferries that we studied, which is a real strong signal. This is a very profitable industry, with some very, very weak signals, and that's what we're focusing on, that safety might be a concern. That's our interesting, what we think is the interesting problem there, is how do you pay attention to those weak signals in light of really strong signals that occur elsewhere. And you can think of applications in a lot of different settings that might then come out of that.
How can companies learn from rare events and your failures?
I think the best example to think about in that sense would probably be airlines. So the airline industry is structured in a very interesting way. If you go back and you start in the 1930s and you look at that, an extraordinarily risky thing. Planes are crashing on a regular basis, and there's just clear evidence that the learning in the airline industry has been remarkable, such that it's, as we know, safer than driving. And there are a couple of things that that we want to focus on when you think about learning. One of them is what you might think about as the validity of the knowledge that you have. So can you actually predict that there is going to be some kind of outcome that happens in that setting? Do you have a valid understanding of what the mechanisms are that are working there? And then the second is the reliability of the knowledge. To what extent is that shared? And so if you think about, rare events, the kinds of things that go on, for example, BP and all the stuff that went on in the news, there's some very, what we might call, reliable understandings of what happened there, that is shared by lots of people, that are probably actually wrong. And so what the airline industry does is it focuses not just on failures, but near failures. If two planes might collide, they go back and they research very carefully what would have happened there. What might have caused that collision, how can we avoid it, and what we can do in the future. And then they work very hard to distribute that knowledge. So what you've got is a valid understanding. Here's what actually happened and what actually caused it, as opposed to what you might hear in the media. And then second, a reliable understanding. It's actually distributed amongst lots of different organizations. And so it isn't just the airline that had the accident, then that's promulgated throughout the entire industry. I think that's a nice process to think about, sort of how do you learn from rare events.
What's next for this research stream?
Well, there are basically three things that we're thinking about doing. One of them, actually, we're working on right now. One of them is to think about power and politics in learning from rare events. So when I talked about valid and reliable learning, one of the interesting things that can happen is if you're a leader and one of these things happens in your organization, there's a real temptation to suppress some of the information because you don't necessarily want your organization to look bad. Now that's going to impede some of the learning that goes on. And so what's really interesting about the setting that we studied is you can actually go backwards in time and start to look, and there are these weak signals that were suppressed into these images of kind of valid learning and reliable learning. Two things happen. One of them is really important information that should have signaled there are some risks that we should pay attention to, didn't get addressed. And second, people's voices didn't necessarily get heard. And so that kind of power and politics image, I think, is very important to understand what are the implications of power and politics on how learning processes go on. And again, you can think of plenty of contemporary events where that's an extraordinarily important problem. How do you deal with the politics of the situation and still make learning go on? In second, then you can look at that going forward. And so one of the things that's interesting about learning from rare events is typically what's happening is you've got a new category of some kind of failure that's going to happen. And so we're doing some work on thinking about how do we categorize what happens in a learning setting and come up with the structures that help us understand what are the failure modes, what might happen. And so trying to track over a period of time how did they pay attention to these failures and what categories came out of it. Third dimension that we're paying attention to, that we're looking at, is how do you think about the tails of a distribution? So we're doing some research also in a medical device setting where there's a mainstream kind of, you report quickly and things are very obviously this is where the learning should come in. But in those rare events, you're now into the tails of the distribution, and how does that affect what the competitors do and where the learning goes on in the industry more broadly? So you can think about all those, and then the theme that we'd run through all of that is what attention structures do you have? So how is the industry structured so people can pay attention to failures and the implications of those failures? So that's basically where we're going with the research.